Right, so you'd think after hijacking 40-odd aid vessels, detaining nearly 500 civilians, and striking two of these ships in a Tunisian harbour in the weeks before they got anywhere near Gaza, Israel would be chalking up another win now. Instead, they've been forced to look up and find that another flotilla is already on the way. 11 new vessels, more activists, and the same inconvenient cargo, food and medicine and baby milk. What are they thinking? Oh, and a boatload full of morality as well, of course. See, that's the thing about siege logic, isn't it? It always backfires in the end. The more Israel try to blockade Gaza, the more it blockades itself. Every drone strike and arrest has become a PR own goal. Every seizure another proof that this security state is terrified of cameras and conscience alike. You can board a boat, sure, but you can't confiscate decency. Right, so just days after Israel's navy seized 42 civilian boats in international waters, boats loaded not with soldiers, of course, but with sacks of flour and cartons of insulin and baby formula and hope, well, the horizon fills once more with the sight of more civilian vessels, more of that hope, more of the other stuff too. 11 this time, fewer vessels than before, but heavier with meaning, perhaps we could argue. Doctors, journalists, students and trade unionists from 25 countries have climbed aboard these 11 vessels and pointed their bows towards Gaza. It was the answer to a question Israel never stops asking the world. How much more cruelty can you witness by our hands before you act? The global summit's flotilla had been dragged in chains to Ashdod, 470 activists detained, yet the idea they carried cannot be stopped like that. They will not be broken. More will come. They're already on the way. From the ports of Italy and Spain, the new flotilla has sailed past Crete and already into the eastern Mediterranean. 11 vessels, amongst them the Al-Damir, which is Arabic for conscience, 68 metres long and crowded with medical workers and reporters. It is the very same vessel that Israel struck off the coast of Malta back in May, all fixed up now and back on course. The Ghassan Kanafani is another vessel named for the assassinated Palestinian novelist, and the Al-Auda, which means the return, resurrected from earlier missions that vessel had been on. Cameras, satellite transmitters, and a collective insistence that Gaza is not a crime scene to be cordoned off forever drive them on. The International Committee to Break the Gaza Blockade announced the departure. It was confirmed the convoy's position north of Egypt's Marsa Matruh. But of course they sailed through the wake of a scandal that still reeks. Only weeks earlier, two of the Sumud flotilla vessels had been docked in Tunisia, hadn't they? And they'd been struck by Israeli drones. You might recall this story. Why am I bringing this up again? Well, there's been some developments on that, you see. Where Tunisian authorities initially denied any notion of Israeli interference, it's now been confirmed that Benjamin Netanyahu personally approved that operation. Other nations' borders, other nations' security means nothing to Israel, but God forbid you impugn theirs. Drones apparently launched from a submarine and dropped incendiary charges onto the decks at Sidi Bou Said, damaging boats flying European flags. There were no deaths, of course. It was a demonstration largely. The damage was mitigated. Israel can reach anywhere was the message, and law will not reach back. But it did not intimidate. It multiplied that defiance. Tunisian activists who helped outfit those ships formed what they called the Maghreb Fleet of Steadfastness. They joined the main Sumud flotilla. They, like the other vessels and crews, are being kidnapped at sea. They've now begun a hunger strike in Israeli prison, turning their bodies into a continuation of their voyage. Inside Israel, however, matters have turned a little bit darker and very much stranger. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, for it is he, the man who built a career idolising a terrorist who massacred Muslims in Hebron, arrived at the Ashdod detention compound with a camera crew, of course. He jeered at the seating detainees, called them terrorists and laughed as soldiers watched. They should smell the sweets where the terrorist prisoners are kept, he said later, demanding they be jailed for months instead of deported. The phrase was grotesque, but then so is he. It was also useful. It told the truth about the government's psyche. Cruelty not as accident, but as policy. Netanyahu overruled him and ordered swift deportations, though, and they've already begun, preferring optics to vengeance. Yet both men served the same purpose, one performing rage for his base, the other laundering it for diplomacy. And that, in miniature, is Israel's wider collapse. The siege at sea mirrors the siege within now, a government devouring itself, its ministers fighting not for policy, but for spectacle. When a state needs theatrics to disguise its fear, it's already begun to lose control of its story. The Sumud flotilla itself ended in the way Israel's defenders now call routine. Commandos boarded the final boat, the Marinette, about 42 miles from Gaza's shore, so one more act of piracy in international waters to add to all the other charges. They pointed their rifles at unarmed passengers, they seized the cameras, they cut the radio lines, they towed the ship to port. But the footage leaked anyway. You can confiscate equipment, you can't take away memory. The world saw gunboats hunting humanitarians, and for the most part have been sickened by that. One of the most heavily armed navies on earth chasing a cargo of milk powder because they're terrified of it. The longer the images circulate, the more Israel's deterrence will crack up. What kind of siege depends on suppressing flour? What kind of democracy sends soldiers to abduct surgeons? Though, of course, that's hardly been unique to the flotilla, as it happens, is it? But whilst the commandos were busy performing self-defence for the cameras, Gaza got an unexpected and very welcome opportunity. If the aid can't reach them, then perhaps the distraction presented itself with an opportunity. You see, as the Navy redeployed to intercept all of these flotilla vessels, fishermen were able to reach the sea for the first time in months, and they filled their nets. They caught sardines, not symbolism. Families grilled them on open fires. The flotilla fed families after all, from a certain point of view. That detail mattered more than any press release. It proved that the siege is not a wall of necessity, but a switch that can be flipped. When the oppressor looks away, gets distracted, the oppressed get to live. Israel calls this security. Reality calls it starvation management. But in chasing aid boats, Israel lost control, lost their grip, and Palestinians seized their chance and got fed. The hunger strikes were not solely confined to the Tunisian contingent of the flotilla in detention. Now, Greeks and Irish academics, several doctors, have also refused food. They issued statements through lawyers accusing Israel of piracy and arbitrary detention. In Tunisia, thousands marched on the foreign ministry demanding their release. In Greece, families stood outside embassies holding photos of their loved ones. In Italy, the response turned industrial, of course, dock workers declaring a nationwide strike. 2 million people joined demonstrations across 100 cities, halting ports, trains and airports. Giorgia Meloni dismissed it all as an economic tantrum. The unions called it solidarity, though. And for the first time since the blockade began 17 years ago, European Labour treated Gaza's captivity as part of its own struggle. The line between humanitarianism and class politics is blurred. It is now all the same fight, because it always has been. A fight against impunity above and deprivation below. In Colombia, which had already severed diplomatic relations with Israel, the government praised the flotilla publicly. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, rallies filled city squares. The story was no longer about a few boats. It was about the erosion of fear. Each interception, each hunger strike, each image of soldiers barking orders at unarmed medics chipped away at Israel's facade. You can occupy the land, you cannot occupy perception forever, no matter how much cash you throw at Hasbara. And yet Israel continues to try, desperate, sad, frightened, throwing drones, diplomats, and disinformation, not to mention tantrums, at this rising tide of empathy. What terrifies Israel's leadership the most is that the flotilla is no longer an isolated stunt, but a method, a recurring act now of civil disobedience that exposes both the illegality and absurdity of their siege. Every voyage forces a new dilemma. If they let the ships through, the blockade's fiction of total control evaporates. If they attack them, the moral cost mounts and the cameras roll. Either way, legitimacy bleeds out faster than authority can be asserted. The sea becomes not a buffer zone, but a mirror. And in that reflection, Israel sees, as others do, a power so terrified of scrutiny that it mistakes compassion for conspiracy. This fear has become its policy. The state has expanded the definition of terrorist to include anyone who challenges its monopoly on violence or narrative. Journalists documenting war crimes, terrorists. Medics treating the victims of their bombings, terrorists. European trade unionists refusing to handle Israeli cargo, terrorists. All are Hamas. The word has been drained of meaning and filled with convenience, yet language has a recoil effect too. When every opponent is a terrorist, the category eventually ends up engulfing the accuser. Israel is now trapped in its own rhetoric, a democracy that behaves like the caricature of tyranny it once claimed to oppose. Meanwhile, Netanyahu clings to his balancing act, hawkish enough to satisfy the far right, pragmatic enough to keep foreign aid flowing. But the drone strikes in Tunisia exposed the limits of his stagecraft. Ordering an attack in another sovereign country to destroy unarmed boats was not strategy, it was compulsion. And added to the strike on Doha last month, adds to his perceived desperation too. It told allies and enemies alike that Israel's sense of immunity now exceeds any sense of reality. And it forced a quiet panic in Western capitals. How do you defend an ally who bombs humanitarians in someone else's harbour now? How many times can you call lawlessness self-defence before the phrase collapses under its own weight? Netanyahu's government has turned its own siege into a spectacle, and the world is more and more seeing straight through it. The flotilla's re-emergence once again now already is therefore more than a symbolic gesture, it's another geopolitical test. If Israel attacks again, it risks alienating the few European governments still willing to parrot its talking points. If it refrains, it concedes weakness. For once, activists have engineered a scenario in which moral clarity and strategic leverage coincide. Their courage creates a trap, and the only escape is honesty. That's why the fleet matters even if it never reaches Gaza. It forces the world to watch a government choose in real time, over and over, between law and lawlessness, and they always end up choosing wrong. Inside the prisons, the hunger strikers keep count of their days. Outside, solidarity campaigns grow. The effect is cumulative, not spectacular, a slow-moving moral landslide. Israel's traditional defenders in the media can still suppress one story, but they cannot suppress the pattern. The question that haunted the Mavi Marmara massacre in 2010, how could this happen again, now has an answer. It keeps happening because the world let it. But this time the world is smaller, more connected, less willing to pretend ignorance. Every intercepted ship now live streams its own evidence. Every detained journalist files testimony before the signal dies. Every government statement that calls for restraint on both sides sounds hollower and hollower against that footage of warships surrounding fishing boats. And then there is Gaza itself, the heart of this endless rerun. Beneath the blockade statistics live 2 million people whose lives are measured in litres of clean water and hours of electricity, and against the daily death tolls. For them, the flotilla is not a spectacle, it's a heartbeat. News that another ship has set sail means they have not been forgotten. It means someone out there still believes their survival is worth the risk of arrest or the cost of their own lives. When those boats appear on the horizon, even if they never dock, they break the monotony of siege. So in that sense, the flotilla's success is already real. Its cargo is morale. The Israeli government understands this, which is why it reacts with such disproportionate fury. The blockade is a performance as much as a policy. Its purpose is not merely to control Gaza, but to display control, to make hopelessness visible. Every act of defiance, therefore, undermines not the military calculus, but the psychological one. If the oppressed begin to believe that the cage can be opened, then the warden's authority erodes, and so the state overreacts, sending commandos after volunteers, ministers after medics, drones after dogs. Each overreaction reveals their weakness as they try to project strength. The international response, slow but cumulative, marks a shift. Ireland, Belgium, Spain, Norway have all lodged formal protests. The UN Human Rights Office described Israel's interceptions as a dangerous precedent for humanitarian access. Amnesty International called them deliberate acts of intimidation. Even typically cautious newspapers in Europe have begun describing the blockade as collective punishment. That language matters. Once something is named, it can be prosecuted. Israel's diplomats know it, which is why they spend so much time managing vocabulary as much as they do borders. But language too is slipping from their grip. The word flotilla no longer conjures image of provocation, but of persistence. The word blockade now evokes cruelty, not discipline. And the word security, repeated endlessly by Israeli spokespeople, sounds less like reassurance than addiction. Security from what? From accountability? From empathy? A nation that claims to be threatened by aid boats has already confessed to how weak and petty and pathetic and cruel it truly is. So as the new flotilla advances, the pattern repeats again. Radar pings, intercept orders, diplomatic warnings. It's something intangible has shifted. The moral centre of gravity is no longer where Israel believed it to be. The courage of a few hundred civilians has done what decades of negotiations could not. It's reframed the siege as a universal question of conscience. When governments fail, people act. And still, the deeper questions echo beneath the data. Why does the world tolerate one nation's right to police international waters? Why is collective punishment still defended as self-defence? Why do Western democracies arm a state that shoots at journalists and starves children? Each new flotilla forces those questions back onto the table. The answers, or the refusal to give them, define not only Israel's character but theirs too. And there is also the matter of precedent. If Israel can seize civilian vessels and open seas without consequence, acts of piracy, any state can. Maritime law is meaningless and begins to rot. The line between order and piracy blurs. What is permitted in the name of one blockade becomes available to all. The world's silence, therefore, is not neutrality. It's complicity in the corrosion of its own rules-based world order. The flotilla's endurance proves that empathy, when organised, is stronger than fear. That's why the story matters beyond Palestine. It asks every observer, every bystander, what they would do when faced with an injustice so visible that to look away is an act of participation. Soon enough, the next confrontation is going to play out. Warships will shadow the 11 vessels. Commanders will weigh the optics of violence against the illusion of control. Perhaps they will board the ships again. It's probably a very safe bet, isn't it? Perhaps they will tow them into Ashdod and stage another victory, but every victory like that is hollow. The blockade survives materially, even as it collapses morally. Each act of suppression enlarges the audience that no longer believes the script. The world is learning to see through the performance. In the end, what remains is not the outcome of any single voyage, but the accumulation of defiance. The flotilla sails because silence is worse. It sails because legality without morality is merely procedure. It sails because even a failed attempt to reach Gaza succeeds in exposing the absurdity of those who claim ownership of the sea and of the Palestinian territories. History will not remember the serial numbers of the gunboats or the bureaucrats who signed the seizure orders. It's going to remember the moment ordinary people decided to test the horizon. It will remember that when governments looked away, citizens steered into the storm. It will remember that freedom is not granted but insisted upon. And it will remember that on a planet where borders are enforced by drones, a handful of boats dared to prove that conscience still floats. The siege will end, though no one can say yet how. Perhaps through diplomacy, perhaps through collapse, perhaps simply because cruelty ends up exhausting and destroying itself. However it happens, when it happens, historians will trace its undoing back not to speeches in parliaments, but to small, stubborn acts of navigation. To the day Gaza's fishermen hauled in their first catch in months. To the night medics and journalists who set sail knowing they might not return. To the hunger strikers who turned captivity into protest. To the moment the blockade wobbled and the world saw it happen. The question now is not whether the siege will fall, but how many times Israel will destroy its own credibility before it does. And when that reckoning comes, those who stood by will claim they didn't know, as they always do. But they did know. They saw the ships. They saw the drones. They saw the mockery and the hunger and the courage. They saw a nation so frightened of empathy that it fired at aid. And they saw the opposite too. A handful of people who refused to stand aside like they did. Plenty of people who did not sail to Gaza are acting in defiance too, as the mockery of Giorgia Meloni of Italy is now biting her firmly on the backside, with national strikes sweeping the nation. Get all the details of Italian solidarity and karma for their fascistic government in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.